So we've seen in plants, we've seen the structures that are involved in sexual reproduction, the structure of the flower, and we're going to build on that this time, go into a little more detail about the cells involved, and start looking a little more big picture at what it all means for the life of the plant. So a nice illustration here. This is one of our flies. Actually, I don't know where this one is from, but this is a fly that looks like a bee. It's meant to kind of turn things that might eat it, turn it off by looking like something that's unpleasant to eat. And these are flies that still accomplish fertilization of the plant. So they do pollination. There's actually quite a few flies that are able to do pollination for plants. And there's one of them here. They visit flowers and they carry pollen. So pollination, the details of pollination, we're talking about the process of moving pollen from one organ to another. And so I've got a nice simple flower here. This is a flower that's got only two anthers. That's what these are. And one style and stigma at the top here. So a little more simplified to illustrate the specifics of pollination. When we use this term pollination, this is referring to the movement of pollen from the anther, where it's produced and distributed, to the stigma. And I suppose people are more often using this term to refer to the successful deposit of pollen onto a stigma. And that's an important part in sexual reproduction for flowering plants. And as we'll see, this isn't necessarily going to guarantee that fertilization happens. So the pollen grain, as we saw, carries sperm cells in it. And the female part of this plant here, the stigma receives the pollen, but the pollen's got to grow down this long thing, long in this plant anyway. That's the style. And then located down here in the ovary, which doesn't look like much, kind of light colored, located down here are the ovules, which contain egg cells. So pollen making it to the stigma is pollination, and that's still a long ways off from complete if you're looking to complete the process in terms of fertilization. So we'll look at that in a little more detail today. So pollen grains, ovules, and then importantly for the female part of this, the structure called the style, which is just a lot of plants, long tissue connecting the stigma here, the pollen receiving location, connecting that to the ovary where the ovules themselves are located. So before we go too much detail in the flowering plants, let's take a step back to our seedless vascular plants here. This is the life cycle of a fern. And just highlighting, if you remember, we saw in this group we had spores were the main mechanism for dispersal. So getting a plant around and establishing a new plant. In a fern, that involves one of these spores landing in a suitable habitat and growing up into this short-lived, easy to miss little gametophyte structure. But on this gametophyte are structures that produce egg and produce sperm. They can do that in the same gametophyte. Sometimes you have single-sex gametophytes that produce only sperm or only egg. And then those combine together in fertilization, and the cycle goes on. So this part of the life cycle in ferns has homologous features in the flowering plants and the seed plants. And as we'll see, basically this spore here, there's a specialized version where the spore is male in the pollen. So pollen is basically a male spore with the gametophyte inside. So this thing that's still not very big in ferns, in the seed plants, becomes actually contained within the spore, except after germination, it does that, as we saw, growing towards the ovule. So gametophyte with sperm inside of a spore makes a pollen grain. Female gametophyte with an egg inside of a spore makes for a ovule, basically. So these parts of the life cycle that we see as separate in the ferns are going to be kind of condensed all up into one structure, the pollen grain or the ovule in the seed plants. So I guess while we're talking about ferns, this was an interesting study from not too long ago, just kind of highlighting how there can be a lot of differences in sexual reproduction in ferns, even though this structure is short-lived and one that a lot of people overlook. can have different cases where a plant can self-fertilize. So if the same gametophyte produces sperm cells and egg cells, and those sperm cells from one part swim over to egg cells on the other part, it can actually self-fertilize. And genetically, that's an interesting combination in ferns because each of these structures is haploid, and since they arose from the same starting gametophyte, they're going to be genetically identical. So they basically have made a diploid that is entirely homozygous. So it's sort of a completely inbred sporophyte that results from that. Sporophytic selfing, this is the case where two different gametophytes are made. They are genetically produced from the same parent sporophyte. They're not identical, but they have the same limited number of genes and alleles that started off here. And if they cross, that's basically self-fertilization of the sporophyte itself. So there's still some genetic variation, but it's a subset of the genetic variation that's already found in the parent plant. So still a lot of inbreeding there. And then this form called outcrossing. Outcrossing is basically a contrast to selfing or inbreeding. Outcrossing meaning we've got two genetically different or genetically independent, at least, sporophytes here. They each make their own gametophytes, and sperm cells from one fertilize the egg cells from another. This would be the greatest amount of genetic variation, starting with two different sporophytes. So lots going on, even though it's under the surface of what you might normally notice. So moving up to the seed plants, both the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, whether you've got flowers or not, if you produce seeds, then that means you're reproducing with pollen and ovules. So here's our case from conifer. A pine tree has got pollen cones and ovule cones, and then the pollen makes its way through the air, oftentimes to a different tree, and fertilizes the ovules that are located in a young version of the pine cone, basically. And then fertilization happens. Same thing over here in the flowering plants, except we've got pollen produced in the anthers of flowers and ovules produced in the ovary, potentially of the same flower. This is a feature that flowering plants have much more abundantly. And in both of these cases, after fertilization, the seed is made up of the embryo. That's this thing with the two prongs in there. Those are the two seed leaves. This is a diploid starter that's going to become the sporophyte of the next generation, and it's surrounded by food and some protection. Those are common features of seeds. Over here in the non-flowering plants, we've got embryo here in the middle, and then food for the embryo and protection around the outside of that. So again, pretty similar despite the major differences between these two groups. And just a little more detail on the flowering plants. Looking again specifically at these structures, I hinted before, indicated before, that these are basically spores with gametophytes that are stuck inside. So nice durable spore wall, but inside of that, we've got cells, multiple cells. Sorry, this is the starter cell here. This is where it begins as a independent pollen grain. But it ends up with more than one nucleus anyway. This is basically the gametophyte of the pollen grain, and it can grow out as its own structure with now 3 nuclei, as we'll see. And one of those nuclei is the sperm cell. Actually, 2 of them are sperm cells, as we'll see. Over here in the female side of things, this is basically a spore with some cells inside. And in the flowering plants, this culminates as 7 cells with 8 nuclei. One of which is the eggs. We've got 1 egg cell in here, 2 sperm cells in the pollen grain. They find each other, and that's where fertilization happens in the flowering plants. Here's one with a bunch of terms on it. I just wanted to give you the one that doesn't have so much terminology to wade through, but if you need to look at this one, feel free to stop the video and review this. Okay, so hinted at this before. We've got the structures of the pollen grain and the ovule. There is some variation. So we've got flowering plants, angiosperm, cycads, and netum. These are both members of the gymnosperms, or the non-flowering seed plants. And the common structure to all these is a durable wall on the outside and a handful, not a lot, just a handful of these nuclei here and some of them qualify as proper sperm nuclei. So 2 sperm nuclei in angiosperms, 2 sperm nuclei in netum, and 2, actually, these end up swimming in the cycads here. So these are swimming sperm cells that are carried inside of a pollen grain. But big reduction. If you remember, we saw gametophytes were getting smaller and smaller as we moved through land plants to become the flowering plants. And this is about as small as you can get. So just a small number of nuclei contained within basically the size of a cell here, the pollen grain. Female structure, the ovule is bigger, and so it's got a little bit more investment in terms of cytoplasm and then also number of cells. One of those specifically is the egg cell. And we won't talk much about these other kinds, but we will talk about these central cell or polar nuclei, they call them. And those are going to be involved in double fertilization. Not much more to add here, just showing you pollen in a few different organisms. This is pine, where this sac has a whole bunch of different pollen grains inside. This would be basically the same thing, the same kind of structure that we have in an anther of a flower, where there's a chamber that produces and distributes lots of pollen grains. Here's an individual pollen grain, lots of unique shapes in pollen grains, shapes, sizes, dimensions, projections, like this grainy little toothy thing in here. And then pollen, once it lands where it needs to be, the tough grain stays at the stigma where it landed, and it grows out of this pollen tube. So a linear filament of cell growth grows through the female part of the plant in search of an ovule. Here's some more about conifers. This is some details about pine pollen. This is kind of a distinctive shape for pollen of pine trees. It's got these 2 air sacs here that may help with floating around in the wind, may also help with adhering to the receptive female structure. So in gymnosperms, pollen grains actually land on a liquid droplet produced by the female plant at the time in its life when it's receptive, and then developing pine cone here basically with individual structures that will become seeds. And then deep in here, this is where the eggs themselves are located. So a variety of these all produced in the same cone. They all can be independently fertilized and independently develop into seeds. So thinking about how pollen gets around, what does the plant need for this process to happen? It needs to transfer pollen from a flower to a flower, and genetically your best diversity is if your pollen is moving from the flower of one plant to the flower of a different plant. So not a big deal to self-pollinate yourself. Some plants do that as kind of a backup mechanism, but a little bit more difficult as a plant that can't move to get your pollen to go to the receptive part of a neighboring plant that might be quite a ways away. So this is where animals come in. Animals are quite helpful in this, and the behavior of animals ties in nicely with the needs of the plant. The plant does a little bit of bribery to get these animals to move its pollen around, and they've become terribly important to pollination in the flowering plants, the angiosperms. Now, that isn't to say that all pollen is moved around by animals. There's quite a bit of wind pollination in seed plants. So a lot in the gymnosperms, so our pine trees do it, and cypress trees and junipers and so on, lots of wind pollination there. And you can just see the abundance of pollen produced by these plants. So different from, as we'll see in the insect pollinated flowers or the animal pollinated flowers, these flowers are ready to let go of their pollen, and they just readily distribute it into the air at a time when pollen production is cued in to happen. This one's a grass. You can see these kind of purplish colored anthers, really abundant. So there are lots of them. Each of them is producing tons of pollen grains individually, and they're all kind of synchronized to let it go around the same time. When the wind blows or this plant gets jostled, big clouds of pollen come out. Same thing in a pine, so much bigger plant, but same strategy of releasing a lot of pollen into the air. These are the male pollen cones here, set against some female ovule cones that have become seed cones. And then on the right here, this just highlights one thing. If you think about, if you think about these plants trying to get their pollen around, one thing that benefits them is not to pollinate at the same time as too many other species. So if you're collecting up pollen from the air and you pick up pollen from 9 species, and only one of those is your same species, then you've got a lot of competition for space. So these plants have kind of worked it out among themselves to figure out times of the year when one plant can flower without too much competition from its neighbors. What it means for the allergies, if you've got pollen allergies, this means that these plants are basically filling the entire growing season with pollen. So not so great for people, but good to avoid competition among wind-pollinated plants. The more exciting version of pollination usually comes down to biotic pollination. This is movement by animals. So biotic animals involved, living organisms. They have a lot of advantages over wind pollination. They have behaviors, and those behaviors can make them a lot more efficient. So a plant can entice this animal to visit its flowers. It can basically train it to visit flowers of the same kind. So if it keys in and says, this is a plant that I know has good rewards for me in the form of nectar, or sometimes pollen is the reward, the animal is going to keep visiting flowers of that same kind. So it's really a training process. Say, all right, fly, you keep visiting these same yellow flowers. I'm going to keep giving you nectar or pollen, and the fly will do that, or the bee, or whatever the animal is, and get the plant what it needs of transferring pollen between flowers of the same species. So biotic pollination has a few phases. I like to break this down into a few phases. And one of those is attraction. Another one is going to be reward. So regardless of whether this animal is going to be effective at transferring pollen, step one is going to be getting this animal to visit the flowers of your species. So how do plants attract animals to their flowers? So it kind of takes advantage of signaling in the animal world. So there are lots of flowers out there, and insects that are pollinators, they are kind of keyed into certain kinds of signals. So visual signals, these are colors of flowers, sizes of flowers, shapes produced by petals, and other attractions are scent. So scent chemicals are produced by flowers. This is why some flowers smell quite nice to us. People like flowers for their smell. So visual, scent, other attraction cues potentially as well. Some plants have vibrational cues or things like that. But scent and visual cues are probably the two big ones. So this animal is sort of scanning its habitat, looking for signals of where it can get nectar or pollen, whatever it's interested in. And it learns, okay, if I visit this collection of white petals, somewhere in there is going to be something I want. So it learns to visit white petaled flowers, and it's going to do that over and over again. Maybe all of the same species, maybe a collection of plants that have flowers that kind of look alike. But the attraction is kind of the signpost, and it really needs to be followed up by the reward. So knowing that you're going to go somewhere that has a reward, that's the important part of the training, right? So if you, it's kind of like a billboard. If you saw a billboard on the side of the highway and it said, you know, come get a hamburger, and you went there and there was no hamburger, you would stop going to things that look like that, whatever the restaurant chain is advertising. But if you went to a place and you enjoyed your experience and you got food that was good for you, you might choose to visit more places that look the same. So you go to a chain of restaurants, they all have the same signs, the same colors, and it's keying in something in your behavior, your animal behavior, that says, I'm going to go to places that have this kind of visual appearance. So attraction and reward we'll get to in a little bit. Just like, I kind of like this image, this gives you a little better feel for the environment an insect might find itself in. So somewhere in here potentially is some food that benefits you, and you got some choice in the matter. So Which one of these do you go to? Well, it's going to be the one that's got the reward that is best for you for maybe the least amount of effort, maybe the right nutritional complement in the nectar, maybe something that's not hazardous to you for maybe getting into small spaces or something like that. Some of these flowers, like the lupins in here, these are a little bit difficult to access. So they have a reward in there. They've got a color advertising them, but not every animal is actually able to get into those flowers and contact the parts that are going to give the reward. So it's kind of a training ground out in the environment, the animals in whatever habitat it is, and it's going to visit. Over time, it's going to visit the flowers that are giving it the best reward for its particular size and behavior. All right, so lots of different rewards. I mentioned that nectar and pollen both can be used as rewards, and that's certainly true. So some examples here, nice close-ups. I love the images you can find online. So here we've got a beetle chowing down. You can even see the pollen grains around its mandibles. So probably going in for actually a pollen meal in this case. This is, I suggested earlier in one of our earlier lectures, this is potentially one of the first interactions that got animals interested in visiting flowers, is this connection with going to seek pollen. So if you go and you get a big pollen meal, and in the process you get some pollen on your body and you move it around to another plant, you can start with fertilization, or sorry, pollination of a plant without necessarily doing too much that's different from just trying to get your own food. So trying to get the pollen, ending up taking the pollen from one place to another. So some pollen feeding here. Here we got a bee, it looks like, and mouth parts going into a flower here. Can't quite tell where the reproductive parts are on this flower. This one over here. Looks to be maybe some pollen around the top of the, I'm going to say tongue there on this bee, and potentially going in for some nectar here. This one also looks like some nectar feeding, so probing into the cup-like structure produced by the petals of this flower. Digging in down towards the base is a common place to have your nectar reward if you're a flower. And then up here, this is kind of an exceptional case where this bee is actually vibrating to release pollen from this anther in a behavioral thing called buzz pollination. So the pollen doesn't come out for just anybody, but this bee knows how to vibrate and release the pollen, and that gives it special access to the pollen and also makes it still a pretty good pollinator, so transfer of pollen to other flowers. So lots of kinds of rewards. We saw pollen and nectar are the big ones. And again, the kind of reward is going to be one that really rewards the best kind of pollinators. So it's not to say that every flower has a perfect pollinator in mind. It's basically the flower is offering something, and if it works out well, then the flower has good reproductive success, and that kind of trait gets passed on. If the flower tries something, say too little pollen, that might be a flower that doesn't succeed and dies out over time. So really a lot of evolutionary and natural selection interplay here to get the right match between the animals that are good pollinators and the rewards that will entice them and keep them coming back. So I liken this to think of things from the plant perspective and also think of them from the animal perspective. So what the plant does is it kind of varies the offering. Maybe there's different nutrient content in the nectar, different abundance of nectar, different locations where nectar might be available, and so on. The animals are really just trying to get their most efficient meal. So they're going to visit the flowers that they know give them good rewards with less effort. So a lot of times the match of the animal pollinator and the plant is the one that lines them up best with what they both need. So we have a bird here, has a lot of flowers that it's visiting right now, and it's possibly able to eat from all of those in rapid succession. The size of the flower offering is pretty comparable to the size of the bird here. A little bit different size comparison here, but still a good match between the size of this little flower here and the size of the bumblebee and so on. All right, so pollen gets on the animals, sometimes in a little more precise form than others. We've got a willow here that's got a fly crawling over it, and the grains on this fly are just kind of all over the place because it's crawling all over a bunch of anthers that are offering a bunch of pollen. Similar appearance here. This looks like pollen from a different flower than it's actually visiting right now, but just all over this hairy bee here. Bigger animals, you can see this one shows it very nicely. We've got a bird with a dusting of pollen right where its feathers meet the beak. And that lines up exactly where this plant is offering its pollen from. So we don't see it actually visiting, but as it's getting the reward down at the base of this flower, it gets the pollen on its nose. So really good match there. Getting pollen on the body often is at the same location roughly on the plant, on the flower, as the location where the pollen is removed from the body. We'll maybe see that in more detail as we go on. Here's another one, a good size match for the locations of these anthers and the behavior of this bat that's able to feed while flying and still get a bunch of pollen all over its fur. So good size match, good position of the pollen. From the plant's perspective, it would rather put pollen just where it needs to have it and not waste too much pollen putting it all over a body if it's not all going to be taken off at that same place. So a nice image here that I like to use, showing a bee feeding. It's got its head down here in the part of the flower that it's interested in. So it's got this long tongue that's going to go in, collect up some nectar that might be pooling inside of this flower. So we've got a closed tube with some nectar somewhere inside. This bee knows it can grab at this location, nice little grip going on there, and stick its tongue in here and get a nectar reward. So the bee's getting what it needs. But in the meantime, by holding on to the best place to hold and putting its head at the best place to lap up some nectar, it's also positioned itself at a wonderful spot to get pollen on it. So the stamens are curved like this. They got their anthers right here, right on the thorax of this bee. And it's a really hairy thorax. So even if some of the pollen falls off or gets groomed off, a lot of it's going to stay in there and get delivered to the next flower. If the bee likes the experience and wants to go visit another one of this same species, it's going to line up the same way. And at some point in that process, it's going to hopefully brush up against the female part of this flower, the stigma, whether on entry or exit, and drop off some of this pollen onto the receptive stigma. A couple other animals in here. There's some bugs, looks like, maybe beetles. Here and here, also taking advantage. They might be in it for leftover nectar. They might be in it for some pollen. I don't know if we'll talk about it much during this topic, but it's possible that not every animal visiting a flower is a good pollinator. For example, this beetle isn't really contacting the anthers or the stigma, and really unlikely that it would, but it might still be taking resources from the flower. Plants that are wind pollinated, I mentioned, often just drop their pollen all around. And pollen that is picked up by animals really has to stick around in place until it contacts an animal. So it's like hold for delivery, where these pollen grains are produced. And really like this illustration here at the right. This is the anther closed up. It's produced pollen, but it hasn't dehissed yet. And when it breaks open, it opens up to the world, but its pollen grains are all still kind of stuck together. So they're sticking to each other, they're sticking to the anther. They're not falling to the ground because that would be wasted pollen. And they're not floating around in the breeze because that's also not an effective way to move pollen around. If you are an animal pollinated species, then your pollen should be usually more adapted to be picked up by an animal. So what causes this stickiness where the pollen sticks to itself and sticks to a visitor? There's a structure, or a substance, I should say, called pollen kit, which is like an oil that some pollen grains exude and makes them extra sticky. So pollen grains can be sticky for each other, sticky for the anther, and this helps them, of course, to be picked up by animals also helps them to stay on the anther before they're ready to be picked up. So it's sort of a stickiness to their home base, then becomes a stickiness to the animal that picks them up. Another structure that can hang out with pollen grains is called viscin. Same kind of thing, where it's actually strands of this stuff called viscin. These arrows here, here's a couple, some more arrows. Some pollen grains have this structure. It's almost like silly string, but it's another one of those that's sticky and allows them to be picked up by animal visitors.